What's going on, guys? Evan, the MTG enthusiast here, bringing another MTG deck tech slash commentary. This time I'm going to be talking about my take on Tidus Yuna's Guardian. This is originally the Counter Blitz pre-con, but it's been heavily upgraded. I mean, there's more cards that are new than there were cards that were from the pre-con. So let's jump right into it. So I've got these divided into tags here. This is my custom when I'm doing kind of these deck techs on YouTube. This is something I own in paper, sans a few cards, but this is generally it. There are a lot of budget replacements, so don't get worried about the $1,800 price tag. Most of that is tied to the land base. And you could easily play this deck without dropping $2,000 on duels. You can actually play this as the precon right out of the deck, and you're most of the way there. But we're going to go ahead and start with the commander, of course, and talk about Tidus and a little bit about what we're doing with this commander. So, at the beginning of your turn, you may move a counter from target creature you control onto a second target creature you control. So, this lets us flip counters between our creatures. Notably, it's only creatures, right? So, we can't grab counters off of lands or off of other permanents, which can be fairly limiting. It actually takes what would be some really powerful cards for this list and makes them kind of mid. So that's kind of a letdown, but the commander's still super fun and has a lot of fun little synergies we can do. Additionally, we have Cheer. Whenever one of your creatures control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card and then proliferate. Do this only once each turn. Um, so we've got card draw stapled onto our commander, which is always great. The proliferate, which really lets this deck kind of go off once things are really going well. On the downside, though, we have some limitations. And so, some deck building philosophy before we even get into the individual card selections, because we'll go through most of them. So, Titus is a 3-drop commander, and that leads a lot of players to immediately slam all their 1 mana accelerators. So, you'd see Birds of Paradise, you would see Noble Hierarch, you would see Llanowar Elf, you would see um, Findhorn, well, not Findhorn Elves, but basically all the 1 mana dorks, and then you'd probably see Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth. All those cards, Delighted Halfling, all those cards are very good in this list. Those cards are pretty good in any list that's a 3 mana commander to a point. The downside of playing a bunch of 1 mana dorks and accelerators in a list like this is they make terrible top decks late game. You're trying to win through incremental advantage and often damage. And so those make really miserable late game top decks relative to some other 1 drops you can run. Additionally, Titus requires counters on creatures in order to get the big payoff. A 3/3 for 3 is fine, but rather unexciting, and a lot of these abilities don't work without counters. In fact, none of these abilities work without counters. And Titus, of course, doesn't add counters on his own, meaning we need other things to put the counters on the creatures for Titus to pop off. And so it's actually really difficult to go land, turn 1 accelerant, turn 2 Titus, and actually get a payoff when you swing, unless you can drop something on turn 4 that can put a counter on Titus. And while that's certainly possible, that's not the way I decided to go with this list because it makes you get a little bit 4-drop heavy and 1-drop heavy. And it makes the 3 drops kind of awkward to play with. It can definitely be done. There's definitely a version that goes hard on the 1 mana dorks and hard on the payoffs on 4 and 3, and you kind of mostly skip 2. But I think some of the best cards for Titus are on 2. And so, once again, the general premise is rather than rush straight into Titus, we want to forego a lot of that ramp and instead play ramp that has a secondary effect that's really beneficial to Titus and then go from there. So a little bit slower, but certainly more stable, and you're certainly going with that incremental game plan, which I think is the way to play this commander. He is fairly complicated to build well, in my experience. Boning him as a general Bant pile, no problem. But if you really want to make your card choices make a lot of sense, I think there are easier commanders to build around. The other commander that, of course, was the precon Yuna, I think is actually a much easier deck to build because it goes infinite with pretty much any untapper. So it's really easy to break Yuna in that regard. But that's not the route we're going. We are shooting for somewhere from a low 3 to a high 2. We're playing 0 game changers. If we were going to play some game changers, we could take this to a high 3 pretty easily, I think. But that's not the direction we're going. So let's jump into the actual cards here. So this is the land base. If you don't want to and or don't own or don't want to proxy some of these really expensive lands, instead of all these duels, you can just play any of the tap duels if you want. That's also has both land types, or you can play really any of the dual lands. So just find the dual land of your preference on these colors, and you'll be fine. It really doesn't matter. The mana isn't too strict. The color combination counts here are about accurate. I do like the filter lands in Tidus because I often need to make these combinations. Of course, them not tapping for a color unto themselves can make these tough if you get several in your opening hand, but I think the filter lands are still fine here. But feel free to shake up the mana base if you don't like my choices. But these have been working fine for me. All right, so let's get into the counters, right? So we want to put counters on our creatures and have Tidus moving them around and get paid off. So our top choice here is the Agent's Toolkit at 3. And so this is one of the ways we can reliably get counters that aren't just 1/1 counters. We can get flying or death touch or shield counter. Then we can move those around. And ultimately, we get to sacrifice this artifact when we've got all the counters off it. It also moves it for free. Only on ETB, though, right? And so we need to have this in play before we play the creature, which is normally fairly limiting. But with Tidus, we can drop them out of order and still move the counters around. It's actually pretty great in this deck. And unless I was trying to make it turbo as fast as possible, I can't see myself not playing this in the list. It's also really nice to be able to get access to shield counters in a way that doesn't make you sacrifice a lot. Because shield counters, of course, are a great way to give yourself a regeneration protection shield on your critical pieces, but you don't want to have to spend too much mana to get them, and that's always helpful. And so this is a great middle ground. It's also, frankly, just a lot of fun. Really recommend it. Arwen. So Arwen sticks on theme with our 3 drops and a lot of the drops in this deck, and that she brings her own counter to the party. So 2/2 for 3, pretty lackluster, but bringing the indestructible counter is wonderful. We can remove the indestructible counter from her with Tidus or Tidus, depending on your inclination on that. But moving the counter off of Arwen and moving it to your commander is a great way to make yourself really removal proof from anything except like swords and Path to Exile and those type of exile effects. And exiling a Tidus is often not something a lot of players are interested in doing. It's a 3-mana commander, and there's probably more threatening things we need to save those pieces of removal for. But otherwise, even if you don't immediately need the indestructible counter, this also allows us to pay the 1 and, of course, generate additional counters. So we get up 2 counters overall, right? So we lose indestructibility, but we can go +1/+1 and a lifelink counter on another creature and a +1/+1 counter back on Arwen. So this is great. You get, you trade off 1 counter and you get 4 counters to move around total. This can be really wonderful if you're trying to proliferate. You just need to get some counters across the table. It's mostly here to be a self-sufficient way to get counters, and indestructible counters are very valuable because there's not a lot of undercosted cards that bring them to the table. Benthic Biomancer, absolute all-star in this list. Bulk rare, but really does the work here. So one of the first things I did when I was working on this deck was I actually cut my Birds of Paradise and things like that to actually play creatures that I could drop on the 1 and 2 mana slots wherever possible. There aren't a lot of good ones, but there are some, and this is an all-star. So we can adapt, so we can bring our own counter to the party on turn 2 if we don't have something better to do. But whenever we get a counter on this, we get to loot, right? We'll draw a card and we'll discard a card. We don't really care too much about the cards in our graveyard, but just getting to filter cards early game for such a low opportunity cost, this is a wonderful card. I strongly recommend running it in your Tidus list. Bristly Bill is like $40. It could easily be replaced with another 2-drop that brings his own counter. There's some in the pre-con even that are not as good as Bristly Bill. But Bristly Bill, if you kept a intelligence starting hand, you'll almost certainly be able to drop a land on turn 3, which will let you put your counter on Bristly Bill, and then you can attack with Tidus and get your card draw, and over time you'll get lots of counters. He also, of course, for 5 mana, gets to put a 1/1 counter on everything, so Bristly Bill is wonderful in here. He's a wonderful card in general with only a couple printings, so very expensive. Not much to say for him otherwise. He's not in here for a particular reason other than the landfall trigger and being probably the most efficient 2-drop in that space. District Mascot. So District Mascot is another interesting piece here. Um, it is a creature that brings his own counter, so he's a 1/1 on curve. He doubles as artifact removal, albeit fairly inefficiently, because you have to remove them from the district mascot as opposed to from another creature. But there aren't a lot of 1 drops that we want to play, and this one's actually pretty good. So the saddling works really well if you hit it on curve. So if you drop District Mascot on turn 1, turn 2, maybe you do drop one of the 2 drops we'll get into here shortly, can attack with it right away, but can immediately use the ability to saddle the District Mascot, swing, get your second counter. Now you're off to the races. You've got your Disenchant ready to go, or not really a Disenchant, but you've got your Oxidize ready to go to punk out someone's Soul Ring if they're just taken away with the game. But otherwise, this is just efficient, right? There aren't a lot of efficient 1 drops we can play in this space that aren't mana accelerators, which just don't fit well on the list. I've been pretty satisfied with it. It might eventually get cut. It's definitely in my potential cut category here, but not because it's bad, just because I think I might be able to do better. Fight rigging. Fight rigging is kind of, once again, bring your own counters to the party. At the beginning of combat, this is critical. So this isn't upkeep. So this lets you sort of drop this before you go to combat on that turn, get your counter to trigger your Tidus draws. This also, of course, lets you do the hideaway thing where you can dig 5 deep and find a card and cheat it in. It's very likely at a certain point you'll trigger fight rigging. So this is pretty strong here as a mix of a little bit of card advantage coupled with a self-sufficient way to get your counters going. Once again, you could run other creatures here that add counters. There's a plethora of them you can find on Scryfall, but I've been pretty satisfied with the incremental advantage of fight rigging. Hadana's Climb, this is a very similar type of analysis where this lets us put a 1/1 counter during combat once again so that we can get our Tidus trigger the minute we drop this. And if we have 3 or more counters on it, we'll get to transform it, which will be a little bit of ramp, which we're not too terribly interested in. But the flying and the +X is pretty great, particularly the flying element, right? We want to get up in the air. Now, you could play Blitzball Stadium over this, which also on curve you can drop for 3 mana, and that will let you spread some counters out, and eventually to let you draw cards and add evasion with a 3 mana activation. But I prefer this because once you drop it, you immediately get paid out, and it'll keep paying you out turn after turn without additional mana investment. So I prefer this, but if I wanted to make a change, Blitzball Stadium would be a nice organic slot. Hardened Scales. So Hardened Scales represents a combo in this list. It's also just generally a powerful card because as we move counters from Tidus, we'll be triggering this and getting 2 counters instead. And so this kind of pops off on it. It also goes infinite with Walking Ballista and another card here we'll discuss later. But I've been really satisfied with it, particularly in the 1-drop slot. It isn't extremely powerful so much as it's very powerful and very low curve and very low mana. So not a lot of investment with big rewards. So I've been really satisfied with it. Hopeful Initiate. So Hopeful Initiate is a 1/2 for 1. So actually pretty well costed. The ability is relevant because we can remove 2+1 counters from among creatures you control. So this lets us remove them, of course, off of a wider variety of creatures than we were limited to with our district mascot here. But additionally, with Hopeful Initiate, we have training, right? And so training, whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a 1/1 counter on this. Drop this on turn 2. Drop this on turn 1 or turn 2. Turn 3, Tidus on curve, swing. You get your counter, you get your triggers. It's great. Innkeeper Talent. So Innkeeper's Talent is absolutely wonderful. So this is just a better version of the ongoing at the beginning of your turn, at the beginning of your combat, rather. Put a 1/1 counter on a target creature. We can also level this up to get Ward 1, which is a nice protection piece for our guys. And then ultimately we can max out and turn into a doubling season, which really we'll rarely do. But late game, if we're kind of in a grindy match, it could be nice to max it out. But really we're playing this for the 2 mana, get your 1/1 counter. It's just an undercosted version of Hadana's Climb. Colony of Whispered Hopes. So this is great here, right? So it's a 1/1 for 3, which is very poorly costed. But it is a dork, taps for mana, but it can add a lot of mana as it gets counters transferred onto it by Tidus. And of course, this also is like a hardened scale stapled to a Llanowar elf that grows, stapled to an incubation druid. Really flexible card. Also, another opportunity to go infinite with Walking Ballista as kind of an out to the combat damage plan. So we've got Kamari here. At 4 mana, Kamari is definitely on the expensive side. The Vigilance keyword, while nice, is probably not enough to justify an additional cost. But the nice thing about Kamari is he is self-generated on his counters. So he's very compact, right? We're paying 4 mana, which does fit with some of the limited ramp we are playing. We get to force him out. He'll get his own counter, so he'll trigger Tidus on his own, and then he also gets to clone something on the battlefield. So none of these effects unto themselves are worth 4 mana. It's because you're stapling them all together that you have a really high impact card in one slot in the deck. And since this deck's trying to do a lot of things, it's a fairly tight list, and so his flexibility justifies his place in the list. Luminarch Aspirant. This is a 1/1 for 2 that can put a counter on himself or something else at the beginning of combat once again. So he'll buff himself the turn he comes in. So at worst, he's a 2/2 for 2. And over time, he's pretty nuts in this list. So definitely one of the stronger 2-drop options if you're on the 2-drop plan, which I am. Maester Seymour. So Maester Seymour, he'll put counters on each of your creatures that comes into play, all on his own. So for 3 mana, you're automatically getting a 1/3 that's buffing all your guys. And you can make a monstrous to get a lot of counters on things. The nice thing is, since we can move counters onto him, of course, with Tidus, over time he can just take over the game where your entire board is getting grown, +2, +2, +3 per creature drop. We are running a lot of creatures. There's a lot of value here. This also goes infinite with Sage, which we'll go over here shortly. Ozolith, the Shattered Spire. So very compact in this list. Unto itself, I don't actually think it's necessary in here, but we have the hardened scales type effect once again. It can put counters on things all on its own. So this can be nice if you're kind of starved for counters on a particular turn. Worst case, if you don't need either of those effects, you cycle it for 2 and move on with your life. Once again, we're playing this because of how compact it is. It does a lot of the things for us with just one slot. Shall I? So this is a very greedy include in this list, but giving you planeswalkers you control, hexproof across the board is really powerful, and there's a lot of indestructible in here and efficient mana costs. So this plus some of our indestructible stuff, and this thing becomes positively game breaking. You just take over the board, you can't be removed. Then over time, you can get your +1/+1 counters, and you incrementally just destroy the table. That said, at 4 mana, it is very, very greedy. There's probably a world where you could cut this for something more efficient, but I like, since a lot of the Commander games I find myself in, we're aiming for like that bracket 3 experience, probably even the low end of bracket 3. And so being able to play a little bit later into the game has been something that's benefited me in my deck building philosophy. I also think this is generally pretty strong, and it also has great synergy with Court of Calling, which is in this deck, which we'll talk about here a little bit later as well. Shalinda. Okay, so Shalinda, 2/2 for 2, aggressively costed with lifelink. Lifelink, which is often a relevant keyword, as we do have some lands that hurt us. But whenever another creature control enters, put a 1/1 counter on it. Otherwise, you put a counter on Shalinda. So this is one of those cards that kind of smooths out bad draws, right? We don't want to hit a game, or at least we want to minimize the games where we don't have a good 1 or a 2-drop play and we can't afford a mulligan. And so we're just going to go land, Tidus, and kind of be in a bad way. We want to have reliable 2-drops, and Shalinda is very reliable in that we can drop Shalinda on turn 2, Tidus follows on turn 3, trigger, we get that counter on Shalinda, then Shalinda can swing and get that all-important card draw and trigger the Proliferate. And then from then on, Shalinda is buffing the rest of our creatures that come in. Once again, it's basically you're conceding the fact that you don't want to have games where you don't have any plays before Tidus to get the counter game going, and Shalinda fits in so nicely at 2. Sphere Grid. So Sphere Grid, once again, this is another one is before combat, put a 1/1 counter on a creature. And of course, once we get 1/1 counters on our guys, we get reach and trample. Trample being a very relevant keyword in this list. So Sphere Grid is wonderful. I would absolutely suggest playing it. When you start looking for cuts, you're going to want to be looking at probably Fight Rigging or Hadana's Climb before you look at any of these other counter givers. Tekethal. Once again, Tekethal pretty greedy in this list, but pretty excellent. So 3/5 for 4, flying. The flying is relevant because it often lets us get in past blockers, of course, and trigger Tidus. And if you proliferate twice instead. So Tidus 3, Dis on 4, get a good swing with any of your creatures on any of the open players. Trigger proliferate twice, get a bunch of counters. If you get to untap with your board, then you can start removing the extra counters you have on creatures and getting indestructible counters that Tidus can move around. This thing is a load of fun in this list. The downside is it doesn't draw you any cards, and it only is really doing something when you are already kind of winning or in a good place. So this is one of those scary cards where the effect is wonderful, but you're starting to border on that win more type space. Like if Tekethal's taking over the game, you were probably already in a really good position. But that said, the longer you go before reaching a board state where you really can't fall back behind, or you know, this makes it so if you are ahead and you're trying to get a good early lead here with this list, you get ahead early and you keep it going. This kind of makes sure you pull ahead so far that you're always going to be a relevant player in the game if Tekethal's around for just a turn or two. I ultimately think there's a chance that this is going to get cut from this list as I further revise it, but for now, I've been very happy with it, and I don't think it's ever going to be a card where you're upset it's in your deck list, right? This is one of those cards, there might be something we can optimize over it, but generally speaking, we're not sad that it's in here. The Ozolith, so we're playing a ton of cards similar to the Ozolith. Basically, we're kind of on this plane of it's very difficult to get the counters we've generated completely off the table. We have quite a few protection cards in the Ozolith, in Yuna, in protection spells, things like that. It's tough to completely remove the counters we've built up, and that's really relevant in a list like this because we don't want to ever get so reset that we have to start from scratch on turn 6 or 7 because this deck just isn't positioned to do that very well. And the Ozolith at 1 mana comes down as early as possible. Tidus's Brotherhood Sword. So, once again, this is the Sword of Truth and Justice. Most of us are familiar with it. But getting the 1/1 counters and the proliferate all in one card is really powerful. Of course, the art is very on theme. And so I'm partly playing it for flavor and because I think it's generally strong here. Do I think that there's a world where you cut this and just play some additional counter-generating creatures? Yeah, probably. But this is not a bad draw in most stages of the game, and the protection from white and blues are relevant colors, particularly to avoid the exile effects that come out of white and the bounce that comes out of blue, because we have indestructible counters spattered throughout the deck. I've been satisfied with it, but I could definitely see myself cutting it for something more conventional. So Trommel here. This is an interesting card because normally you have these +1/+1 things you're like, but don't you make tokens? I really don't. There's hardly any token generation in this deck. And so as a result, we've got the option to have a proliferate per turn right off Trommel here. And Trommel himself ensures that our creatures aren't entering with a 1/1 counter. So basically, once he's on the table, we have a self-sustaining future where every creature we play is going to have the counters it needs to keep the game plan going. Even recasting Tidus if he gets removed, or recasting Tidus off curve. So Trommel's pretty good here. The 3-drop space is a little bit cluttered, particularly with these put a 1/1 counter on things. We'd rather those be on 2 or 1, but there aren't always a lot of good 1 or 2 cards that will scale as the game progresses. So once again, there's a world where you cut one of these 3 mana, add counters to things, but I don't think I'd start with Trommel, right? I'd probably once again start with Fight Rigging. Now we're down to Yuna. Yuna's also a potential cut from this list. Yuna's fine. Yuna's never a card I'm necessarily unhappy to have, but at 4 mana for a 1/5, the stats are not what we're looking for. We don't have any way to combo with her. We're not building the deck in that way. And so she's on the high end of our deck and not particularly bomby. That said, though, we have this effect. Whenever an permanent you control is put into a graveyard, if it had counters on it, you may put that number of 1/1 counters on a creature. So this once again sustains us so that if we do get bombed out, wrathed out, we can move all the counters and keep going, provided we have something indestructible that can survive the wrath that's presumably going to kill Yuna as well. Plus, she also taps, of course, to add a mana and puts 2 additional 1/1 counters on your creatures, and so she can be nice if you can get her out on turn 3 with a limited ramp package, keep accelerating with her. I think she's very reasonable. There is a world where, once again, you cut her depending on how much you want to streamline this list and to make space for your game changers if you decide you're going to play those. And Zach Fair. So Zach Fair kind of does it all. We've got a 1/2 for 1, so the costing is fine. But more importantly, we've got the indestructible until end of turn by sacrificing him. And we also get to move the counter. And if there's equipment, I mean, we have 1 equipment. So if it's the equipment on him, if the Brotherhood Sword is here, we get to move it for free when we sacrifice him. But more importantly, we're just a 1/2 for 1 that has a counter, and we have the option to sack at our leisure and move the counter as well as the equipment. So he just is so efficient, right? There's a lot of cards in here that individually aren't necessarily that powerful, but they synergize so well with the package. And for 1 mana, you can't do a lot better than Zach Fair. So obviously, huge counter theme going on here. Next, we're into how are we going to refill? How are we going to draw cards? We don't need to draw lots of cards, but we do need to ensure we have a stream of cards so we can dig towards our win and or just dig towards our win through a combo or just get enough advantage we'll just kill everyone with combat damage. So Danny Pink, this is probably the best card draw outlet available in the deck. Creatures control of whenever 1 or more counter spins for the first time you turn, draw a card. So when you put a counter on each creature the first time, you get a counter, right? And so if I have 4 counters in play and 4 creatures in play in a Danny Pink, and I can proliferate with Tidus and put a counter on everybody, draw 4. Really powerful, and also a 4/3 for 4 with Mentor, who gets his own 1/1 counters. He's a perfect fit for this deck. So Danny Pink, wonderful, probably the best draw engine available. Falco Spara. So Falco Spara, 3/3 for 4, flying trample, kind of overcosted for what you're getting in this day and age. But he comes in with his own counter, right? So this can be nice if we do have the dreaded, no good counters prior to turn 3. Turn 3, Tidus on curve. Turn 4, Falco. Falco enters, gets the shield counter. Then we can move the shield counter to Tidus and hopefully swing at somebody who's open. If that's not a possibility, this is ultimately flying and will start drawing cards on its own through its evasion. If this also gets cheated out on turn 3, prior to Tidus coming out just a turn later on 4 deliberately, that's also a completely acceptable turn of events. And so he's pretty strong, and once you have a bunch of counters on the field, you get to use those counters to draw cards. And those cards are safe on top of your library as well. It also lets you peek your top card. Once again, this is one of those synergy compact pieces where it unto itself, there are probably stronger individual options, but you're just getting so much in one card that I think it really justifies itself. Fathom Mage. So Fathom Mage, 4 mana for a 1/1, terrible. But he can't get counters on his own, and I guess it's a she. She does get counters on her own, and those counters, of course, cause you to draw cards. We're trying to play a compact list, and so you could cut this for your Rhystic Study, your Mystic Remora. You could cut this for your Esper Sentinel. Those would all be strong choices. Those are always strong choices in any deck you ever make. They're strong choices. But in this list, with Fathom Mage, we're getting card draw into something that, once again, fits into the theme and it sustains itself. It's very strong. It's also a great card to ramp into if you hit that turn 2 ramp spell, which you're not aiming for in this deck, right? We'll talk about the ramp philosophy here shortly. But we're not aiming to skip 2 and go to 4, but we do have a couple ramp things just to, once again, try to spread out and help reduce bad draws by having some land ramp in the 2 slot. That way we can skip into cards like this and bring our 1/1, play any next creature, get a counter, draw a card, and then you're off to the races again. Honestly, with this list, we really don't want to play 4-drop creatures that can't bring their own counter shortly thereafter. There's a couple in here that are like that, but we're trying our best to minimize it because we really don't want that to happen because it can give you bad draws and unsmooth gameplay. That's why once again we've got a lot of potential cuts here that are all in that sort of that same problem. So Inspire Call, this is very compact, wonderful in this list. This is a mix of indestructible and card draw stapled together. Probably needs no more introduction. For 3 mana, this is I actually prefer it to Teferi's Protection in this list, but this is kind of I want game changers. You could swap this for Teferi's Protection, but I'd probably keep Inspiring Call. Kutzel. So Kutzel here, 3/3 for 3. And of course, we're hosing counter spells a little bit. He's also has card draw stapled right onto him in the 3 mana slot. This can be great to once again smooth bad draws. We haven't hit any good counters, so we can just drop this on turn 3 on curve. And then in the future, once we find some counters, this will start drawing cards. We're also going to be counterspell proof. Once again, you've got a lot of power impacted into one card. So really strong in here. Certainly something I'd keep around before I would cut like a Tekkathal. Rather, I would cut Tekkathal before I would cut Kutzel. Just due to the sheer compactness. I actually skipped Ingenious Prodigy. So Ingenious Prodigy is overcosted card draw, but is actually pretty great in here. So the Skull can be really relevant to make sure you get early connections. Now, you can drop this for a 0/1 for, a blue on your first turn, but unless you have something in your hand that adds a counter, I'd probably hold off because you can drop this on turn 2 with its 1 counter. And then, of course, you get the option to remove that counter and draw a card, or more importantly, drop Tidus on turn 3, swing, trigger Tidus, draw your card, proliferate it. On your upkeep, draw another card. It just flows really nicely in this list. Every piece of text on the card is relevant. It's also a bulk bin rare, which is always nice. And of course, we have Polywog Prodigy. So we've got a 1/3 for 2, easily evolved in this list. And of course, those evolutions are going to draw us cards and also curves perfectly with Tidus, right? Polywog turn 2, turn 3, play Tidus, trigger, 1/1 counter, swing, off to the races. And even if things go wrong, you're probably picking up some cards from him. Flex. So for those of you who haven't sort of looked at me do these deck techs before, Flex are just cards that are generally helpful in this list, but they're often cuttable for something else because the deck would function completely fine without them. But they tend to have really high impacts, which is why they stay in the list, even if they themselves are kind of not essential to the overall game plan. Okay, so Herald of Secret Streams. Creatures with 1/1 counters on them can't be blocked. This is great. Drop this on turn 4 with anything out. You're going to ensure that you can reliably connect with your opponents, and you need to reliably connect to get your card draw. And it also is how you take people out of the game. Notably absent from my list, but kind of fun with this, is Chocobo Knight, which any creature with a 1/1 counter gets a double strike. That's how you can start to swing people out with combat damage, but I actually didn't find it to be as impactful as just incrementally taking people out of the game with card draws. Luminous Broodmoth. So Luminous Broodmoth is in here because I hate having my board removed with this deck. And so this is, of course, a load of fun. Whenever a creature without flying dies, return to the battlefield with a flying counter on it. So this is just another way to insulate our board. Now, it itself is flying, so they basically have to remove it first. But if they're trying to slam a Wrath of God or something like that, not a farewell, then they're going to have to put up with your board returning in a flying state for most of the creatures in the list. It itself, of course, is an evasive beater, and I've been very satisfied with it in this list. That said, it's 4 mana for a protection spell. As at the end of the day, you're mostly playing Luminous Broodmoth for the protection. We don't have a sacrifice engine to go bananas with it, but it's really strong for what it does. And if you are like me and you don't want to have bad games, I think overloading this list with protection leads to just overall better games. And so I think it's definitely going to stay in here for me, particularly because it's goofy with Court of Calling also. But there's our options here, and I'll look at some of them here at the end. We go through my considering pile. Once again, we're always trying to shoot for no more than an hour on enemies. So we're over half our time. Sage of Hours. So Sage of Hours is a combo in this list. We don't really have a lot of spells that are ever going to target Sage of Hours, so you're not likely to trigger the heroic on its own all that often. While it's not impossible, it's also not going to happen very often, so I definitely wouldn't bet on it. But Sage of Hours frequently winds up with 5 or more counters on it in a prolonged game, giving you that crucial extra turn. Taking an extra turn unexpectedly is pretty game changing. And since we have so many cards that even if our board gets annihilated, we keep the counters around, this can be kind of fun to dump all of our safe counters onto, right? It's also really fun if you have like throw it out there with Yuna. We come in with a lot of counters initially. It's not going to take long to get up to that crucial 5. It also goes infinite, Sage of Hours plus a variety of different plus +1 counter generators that we can make per turn can get us up to those 5 counters. But notably, if you're looking kind of for the 2-card solution, Seymour pretty easily goes infinite with it, not quickly, but you don't have to invest a lot to make that happen, right? As long as we can get Seymour's power up to give or take about 4, and then we can play the Sage, go to combat, move all the counters onto it, take your extra turn, next turn. And it's really easy to get Seymour and Sage of Fables Sage of Hours, excuse me, working together to take your infinite turns. We have Walking Ballista. Walking Ballista is just generally great. It turns our counters into removal as the game goes on. It also, for 2 mana, lets you get a 1/1 with a counter on it in a pinch. You don't want to be doing that, but sometimes desperate times, desperate measures. But Walking Ballista will go infinite with. We're going to skip down to this piece of interaction. Gata and Luzu. So when Gata and Luzu enters, choose target creature you control. If it's dealt damage, prevent that damage. Put that many 1/1 counters on it. And then you need Hardened Scales or any of the Hardened Scales adjacent cards. And there's a couple others in here, like Kami of the Whispered Hopes. Once again, all cards that we could play in this list without this combo. But with this combo, it's pretty great. So play Gata. This gets this gets the damage prevention. Use it to shoot itself, or honestly use it in response to something to get some counters. Then have a Hardened Scale, and then you can keep shooting yourself with a Walking Ballista to grow it +1 each time, and then you can burn out the table for infinite damage. Once again, the nice thing is, while that's not necessarily something we're going to set up often, which is great because we're not planning to play in like a high bracket. We're trying to have a genuine chance to win the game without being annoying. But Walking Ballista, Sage of Hours, and all of these counter +1 sort of effects are all strong in this list without each other. And so not drawing them collectively isn't the end of the world. All right, now we're down to our interaction suite. We've got our counter spells here. I tend to favor the low mana counter spells that protect my stuff more than anything else. So I've got an Offer You Can't Refuse. We've got Beast Within because it's just general all-purpose removal. At 3 mana, it's very expensive, but it destroys lands. And I can't tell you the number of times I've destroyed a Cabal Coffers and saved the table. So love Beast Within type effects for their flexibility. Counterspell's great. If you're in a blue deck that can handle it, I really like Counterspell. Flare of Denial. So Flare of Denial is another one of those potential cut pieces. We don't actually have that many blue cards in here. And so there is a decent probability that we're not going to have something to sacrifice and it's just a bad cancel. You could play a 3 mana counter here or, a Simic counter spell that gets you some counters or something like that. There's a lot of other options you can run over Flare of Denial. Some of the free counter spells, of course, are always nifty. But that said, I have been pretty satisfied with it, and I'm going to keep it for the time being. I have enough blue creatures that it's free enough of the time. Generous Gift, it's just another Beast Within. Glenna Linger Archmage. So this card is always, a big standout, big winner anytime you play it. So this is basically double negates on a flying creature. But most importantly, persist, right? If it has no 1/1 counters on it, it's going to come back. So it's hard to remove without 2-for-1ing yourself. And it can protect itself from Path to Exile and things that would 1-for-1 it. So it's almost always good value, right? Glenna Linger is almost always good, satisfying value. It flies for that evasive Tidus trigger as the game goes on. But probably most importantly, if we have a -1 counter on it, and we put a 1/1 counter on it, they negate each other, and we have no counters again. If we have a +1/+1 counter on it and it dies, it gets a -1 -1 counter on it. And so we can stack a bunch of counters on this bad boy, and ultimately that allows us to keep this constant negate shield online. It's really, really strong. It's really, really easy to basically say for 1 blue, I will permanently be preventing any sort of instants or sorceries from getting cast, any non-creature spell. This card is a rock star in this list. I don't think I would ever play a Tidus list without Glenelendra Archmage. If I needed a list that was fast enough that this wouldn't be good enough, I just wouldn't play Tidus. Okay. Mutational Advantage. So this is another potential cut. Not because it's bad. Mutational Advantage is actually wonderful. Any card is on my potential cut list, I think you'd be very happy with in your list. But there's other protection options on the 3 slot, some of which are creatures, and it's always nice to have a creature. But this kind of does everything you want, right? So for 3 mana, if we've got counters, we get hexproof, we get indestructible. So it's pretty much unremovable aside from like a farewell or some of the other less played wraths. We're preventing all the damage too. And of course, we get to proliferate. So, big fan. Ripples of Potential. This is a wonderful protection spell on this list. Once again, we get the proliferate stapled on, so we get more advantage and we phase out, which is the ultimate protection from really anything. And when we phase back in, we keep the counters. So, Bristle Potential is bananas. Please play it. Oh, look at my fun ads here. Slippery Bogbonder. So Slippery Bogbonder, once again, 4 mana, flash, hexproof, and a 3/3. Once again, kind of one of those weirdly costed cards where in some ways it's undercosted, in other ways it's overcosted, depending on how you look at it. But there's not a lot of ways to get hexproof counters, and so this lets us, of course, flash something in response to a removal spell, give it hexproof, and now we've got a hexproof counter on the table that we can move around. This also works really well if you've had kind of a messy draw, right? So, we've got our turn 3 Tidus, we didn't have anything in front of it. Go to combat, swing this in or flash this in, get hexproof. You can put the hexproof counter on the Tidus if you want. It's still a counter. It's still going to get you that card draw started. And then you can proliferate your hexproof counter. Next turn, you can move this onto the next creature you play. And now you're distributing hexproof across your board. Really like it. Okay, Ixion. So Ixion does a lot of great things in this list. Once again, we've got a 3/3, so we've got a body, which is already great. The first chapter, right? Our first chapter in our saga here, exile target creature and opponent controls until this leaves the battlefield. So that unto itself is a decent kind of stall tactic. But because we can remove these counters, if we keep pulling the counter off, normally with Tidus, but with anything we want, we keep getting to exile more and more under Ixion. And eventually, this is probably going to wind up being protected by like a hexproof counter or a counter spell. And next thing you know, you're policing the table just with Ixion. And even if you're not in a position to police with it, its chapter 2 still distributes +1/+1 counter. So you get to bolster across two creatures on your table. And once again, you've had a bad draw, you've helped smooth it out. So this is wonderful in this list. Yojimbo. So Yojimbo is just a fantastic card. But once again, we're playing this, probably my favorite 4-drop in the list. We're playing this to get the exile effect. And because we can recycle those effects with Tidus over and over and manipulate these counters, you can get pretty wild with it and keep it around for a long time. Especially because if you're in a pinch, you can get to chapter 2 and chapter 3 and trigger these cannot attack you unless the controller plays 2. So he's like a better Windborn Muse in this deck. It's a much better Windborn Muse in this deck. Cannot see, very much love you, Jimbo. Big praise. Swan Song. Everyone knows Swan Song. Swan Song is wonderful. Once again, kind of fits with my offer you can't refuse. I like to play kind of the low mana counter spells in these lists. Swords, every list needs. If you're in white, I think every list just needs to play Swords to Plowshares, and I'm playing it. We got some lands. Nothing too noteworthy here. We've got plenty of duels that we can fetch with our ramp package here, which we're approaching here rapidly. PC stands for potential cut, and I've kind of talked why I would potentially cut all these throughout the explanation. I think if I had to choose the order I was cutting these, it would probably be Flare of Denial first, but specifically for another piece of interaction. I'm not sure what piece exactly, but it would have to be interaction. I wouldn't want to drop my interaction any lower in this list. If I was going to cut District Mascot, it would probably be for another ramp spell or another 1-drop. It would not be a 2-drop that isn't a ramp spell. Mutational Advantage, this would be dropped for specifically something that offered phasing, because it just tends to be more powerful than any other protection. Techathal, we'd probably drop a Techathal for some other 4-mana, like payoff card that pays off the turn you get it, as opposed to needing to kind of already be ahead. So I'm not actually sure what I would play instead of Techathal, which is one of the reasons he's in here. I really like getting those indestructible counters, but that would be the cut, right? Is we want something to pay off immediately. Yuna, kind of the same thing. We've got a 4-mana kind of win more card. If I were to cut Yuna, it'd probably be for something that either draws me cards specifically or something kind of bomby on the 4-drop spot. But certainly something that brings its own counters to the party, which Yuna currently does. Yuna's also a nice protection piece. So Yuna's probably pretty low on the list to cut on the potential cuts. All right, so ramp. We've got Biophagus, 2 mana. Importantly, this ramps and also, of course, puts a counter on whatever you're ramping. It's also 1/3 for 2, which in that 2-drop, sort of defensive-ish, getting set up slot is pretty wonderful. So I've been very happy with Biophagus, and I think even if I was trying to not ramp at all, I'd probably pay Biophagus. Gyre Sage, once again, comes down on 2 in the ideal world, can make a ton of mana as the game goes on. And most importantly, if you drop Tidus on curve off this on turn 2, you're off to the races with your Evolve trigger. You can get your Tidus trigger, you get your Proliferate trigger, and now it's making a ton of mana. Fits really well on the list, and honestly, even if it doesn't immediately get a trigger to start getting its mana the turn you play it later, that isn't a big deal. The fact that it's getting counters, period, makes it really good on this list. Incubation Druid. So Incubation Druid is probably on the weaker side of the available mana ramp, but it is a bring your own counters, albeit for a lot of mana. And if you do get to cheat a counter onto it early, it accelerates you like crazy. It just makes a ton of mana. So this is where the floor on the card, like when it's at its worst, it's not that bad. And when it's at its best, it's really good. And so for that reason, I like it in the ramp slot. You could certainly cut Incubation Druid for another just ramp spell. I'm not playing Farseek. Farseek is very good. So that would be my cut. If you wanted something that was just more stable down the middle, I think Farseek is your card. Nature's Lore. Nature's Lore fetches a forest. I've often teased the idea of cutting these 2-mana ramp spells to try to get some like 2-mana make their own counters guys, but I've been pretty happy actually smoothing my draws by hitting these. The forest also notably comes into play untapped, so drawing them later doesn't feel as bad because you get to pick up an extra land, comes in untapped, so you usually don't push yourself too far off your curve to do it. And hitting this on turn 2, if you've had a rough start, makes it not so rough, right? Because we have a lot of 4-drops. So now between this ramp, you've probably got Tidus plus a spell or a 4-drop. So I like it. Scholar of New Horizons. This is one of my favorite cards ever printed. I absolutely love it. Positively think about putting every white list. I don't, but I think about it pretty much every time. So we've got ramp here, of course. Someone's going to have more lands than you. We have a ton of dual planes, so this is going to fix our mana. But most importantly, he's a bring your own counter to the party type experience, and so it's so flexible. You drop this on turn 2, I've got my counter, I really need the ramp. Great, we'll take the ramp. We don't need a ramp? Great. Slam Tidus, swing at somebody who's open, pick up your card draw, proliferate, get your another counter, move it around. You're counter farming your land, you're getting more lands, you're ramping. This thing's awesome. Please, please, please play it. We're playing Soul Ring because Magic is a fair and balanced game. 3 visits, same way as when we play Nature's Lore. And Torgal, a Fine Hound. This thing's actually awesome in this list. So we have a decent number of humans, and so it's often going to actually get you the counter. And Tidus, of course, being a human means this kind of falls into that same pattern of if we drop this on turn 2, we could either elect to ramp to 4, not necessarily a bad thing, or drop the Tidus. Tidus will get his own counter, move the counter off of Tidus, back to this if we want to, swing with it, get our card draw, proliferate, or just keep the counter on Tidus and get our cards next turn. It's really, really good here. It's deceptively good. Now we've got some tutors. So we've got Court of Calling. So Court of Calling is generally a strong card. We play enough green that we can hit our triple green. We play enough creatures that we can often convoke. And we've got a lot of great things we can convoke to get. Mostly all those protection creatures. Okay, someone wants to remove your dude in response, Court of Calling. I'll go get my bog bondler here. I'm sure that's not how that's pronounced. But we can go get a lot of different things. Like we can go get we can go get one of our removal spells if we're in a pinch. We can go get Bog Bonder if we need to get hexproof and move our counters around. We can get Glenelinger Archmage to lock out the table. We can get any of these combo pieces, just try to end the game. And we can get the flex slot this Luminous Broodmoth here, which should honestly probably be refiled under interaction rather than flex. So I'm going to do that quick just to make my list clean. But you could most certainly get any of those with Court of Calling, and you're probably going to put yourself really far ahead. Or just end of turn, Court of Calling, and then if they counter it, great. You've probably used their mana. If they don't counter it, great. Go get Cutsoul. Start your turn. Love it. Shared Summons. Shared Summons is a lot of mana. It's the top end of this list at 5. It's actually the only 5-drop. But Shared Summons is actually pretty good in here because it's instant speed. I like to play instant speed tutors wherever I can because depending on what you're tutoring for, you can become arch enemy pretty much instantly. This way, they have to wonder what you're getting and wondering how close you are to whatever you got. You're still going to be scary when you do a Shared Summons, and you have to reveal, but it's at their instep, right? So they don't get a chance to engage until you get a chance to untap, typically. So Shared Summons, this can get probably some sort of setup in the mid to late game where you can combo out and win, or it can just get you set up to take over the board. This is great. I really like Shared Summons in here. There's a world where you play Aldamari's Call instead because it's 2 mana and it's way more efficient. It's also instant speed. Or you play Aldamari's Call over Court of Calling, or you play Aldamari's Call in addition to these, which we'll go over here in a minute. Finally, mass removal. We want them to be trying to mass remove us, not the other way around. So we're not playing any sort of symmetrical board rights. We're not playing Farewell. While those are great cards, fine cards. We want them to try to be wrathing us. If we're wrathing, it's usually supposed to be completely one-sided, and we're going to wrath the table and then blow out the table. So I strongly encourage, if you're playing this deck, not to play symmetrical Wrath of God effects. You want to force them to respond to you. You're the beatdown. You're the aggressor. And if you're sort of playing this defensive back-footed position, you're already in a bad way. And sometimes the only way out is to reset the board, at which point you can just make this symmetrical. If your board's empty, any Wrath is great. But I would stay away from just symmetrical Wraths that are made to be symmetrical. Okay. Wave goodbye. Any list you can run this in, it tends to be completely busted. All right, let's talk about the lands that don't just tap for colors that are pretty interesting. So we've got Galvani Township, Rockstar in here, get counters on all your guys. Strongly recommend it. Land of War Reborn. So Land of War Reborn being a tap land is kind of spooky, but Graft basically lets us once again escape really bad draws. Like we don't want to have draws where we don't have any creature counters on turns 1 or 2, and this helps smooth that out. We've got Spara's Headquarters, which is a great tutor target for any of your land fetch. And of course, we've got Tirate Sanctum here, where this also can put counters on your cards in a pinch. Not something you're often going to want to do. This is really inefficient, but sometimes you just got to get there. And for what it's worth, putting an indestructible counter on something is usually pretty good. Now, we don't have any really gods in here, but we, of course, can make them a god and get there, right? Once again, that's kind of a get there card, and our mana base can afford to play it. Witch Enchanter, of course, probably the most notable MDFC land. Although Hydroelectric Specimen, also worth noting, we can Court of Calling these out because they're creatures on their face upside, and that's a nice toolbox piece for basically no deck space. Okay, we're just about out of time. We got about 5 more minutes, so we're going to hit through some things that are strongly considered but not played. So, Andoril Narsil Reforged. This thing is fantastic, and I've often considered it over Brotherhood Sword, but frankly, you need a lot of creatures in play for this to really start paying off. The City's Blessing, we don't actually make a lot of tokens. That tends to come a little bit later for us as well. And while it's really good, I think there are just better options. Like this is kind of slow. Like it feels really bad to slam this out, put it on something, attack, it gets removed. You're so far behind at that point. I still think you could absolutely run this in this list and have a great experience with it. So if you're looking for like, I want to cut some of these enchantments that put counters on, I want to play something else, I think this is also a strong contender, especially if you're playing more ramp, right? To get this out a little bit quicker because it's 3 to equip. So this is a very costly equipment to play in your list, but the payoff is admittedly fairly large. It was better when I was playing a bunch of one mana dorks. When I had a large number of really weak creatures in here, the ability to suit one up with all that extra mana and get the counters on my table was pretty good, right? It turned sort of lackluster creatures into something meaningful. Once I went away from the one mana dorks package, this card really fell off. Black Panther, Wakandian King. I cannot begin to tell you how desperately I wish that Tidus could move the counters off lands. This would be like the best 2-drop in the world if I could do that. I would play this over Bristly Bill any day of the week. But regrettably, that's not how it works. And so you're going to put your counters on your lands, and so you're going to need something to move them off the lands other than Tidus, which means it's not reliable. Now, for 3 mana, he can move all the counters himself, but and you get your card draw. He's actually pretty good. Honestly, pretty good. I think Bristly Bill is better for what you need most of the time, but I do think that this is a strong 2-drop contender. And maybe in the future, if they print more good counter moving creatures or things that fit well into my curve and my deck list, I'll get him back in here. I can't begin to tell you how badly I want this card to be good in here. And I don't think it's bad. I just don't think it's good. Okay. Dinri, Klin. This is a potential swap for Yuna, right? Brings his own counter, and he puts counters on all creatures that come into play in the future. So, honestly, pretty good. It also gets those counter types that aren't just +1/+1. I found that it really wasn't worth it most of the time, and I found that I'd rather just play Yuna. But if you're also for theme leaning into like, I want all sorts of types of counters, this is a great card. Like, if that's a priority for you, absolutely run this. It's kind of fun in the same way that Agent's Toolkit is a lot of fun. Okay, Kappa. This is just a 2-drop to consider. The ninjutsu is actually at times relevant. It has its own death touch counter, so it's very difficult to block on 2. It will absolutely trigger Tidus. You can move the death touch counter around. And of course, the exile effect can be really nice. Sometimes you just have to get rid of a 1-ring, right? And this is how you're going to do it. So I'd like to find room for it in the 2-drop slot. I haven't found something I'm willing to cut for it yet, but there might be a world where I try to get really greedy and cut, District Mascot for it. That's not out of the question. Laziel and Per Imaginary Friend. This is kind of the same thing, right? They double up the counters you get. They're aggressively costed at 3/3 for 3. Honestly, a really strong card. The downside to it in this list is you have to already be getting the counters, and at 3 mana, you're competing against Tidus for like the I pay you off if you're already getting counters. He just doesn't fit well with the way I structured the deck. But the card is really good. Pelt Collector. This is another like 1/1 option that can almost certainly get counters and start triggering Tidus in the 1 mana slot. He probably gets the most counters of all your 1/1 options. But other than getting 1/1 counters, he doesn't do anything. And so I cut him for cards that I found to be a little more flexible. Resourceful Defense. So this is the only kind of save your counters effect that I think is well costed that I'm not running. It also lets you move the counters around. There's a world where I want to put Wakandian King and Resourceful Defense in here. I really want to do that. I don't think it's as efficient as my current options, but like there's a world where I cut Luminous Broodmoth, run Resourceful Defense, then get Wakandian King in here, and this is another way to move counters off my permanents onto my land. So I don't hate it. I really, really don't hate it. Stonecoil Serpent, this is probably your most efficient. Dump all my mana and get a big XX that you can play in this list. Like, I need 1x per 1 counter, so I can drop this on turn 1 or 2 and get a counter. Smooths out the curve. There's definitely a world where I would play this over some of these other 1-drops. And Swarm Shambler. So I actually really like this, right? It's like a 1/1 that gets its counter, so it triggers Tidus. And then whenever you get targeted, You're going to get a 1/1 out of it, an insect creature token. That's fine. And of course, we also get to put counters on ourselves, but we need a mana to do it. So we're really inefficient, but we're pretty good for what we are. Oh, but I've hit my hour, so I need to really pick it up here. Okay, combat tutorial. So for 3 mana, we get to draw 2 cards and put a 1/1 counter on something. This is pretty great in here because once again, you've had a tough start and you just need to kind of draw out of it. It's kind of playing like Knight's Whisper in black, where you just need to pick up a couple cards to smooth out your hand a little bit. The problem is my 3-drops on the curve is really crowded. So I do think this is strong though. Like this, there's definitely a world where you cut some of the more situational card draw to play combat tutorial, just because you pick up 2 cards and you get your counter and you're off to the races. It's no muss, no fuss, really straightforward. But the high on it just isn't that high, right? Like the ceiling isn't that impressive, and that's why I cut it. Guardian of Faith. So Guardian of Faith, Flash, Vigilance. When this enters, you can phase out your creatures. I constantly debate playing this over Mutational Advantage. I lose the Proliferate, but I get the phasing. I lose the Hexproof, but I get the phasing. And this off Court of Calling is hilarious, of course. Like Court in response to your farewell, get Guardian of Faith, phase out my creatures, lose everything else, but like whatever. My board comes back, punch the guy that farewelled. I really like it. I would not be shocked if eventually I swap out Mutational Advantage for this, because once again, it's a creature. But it doesn't have Proliferate tacked on, and since adding Proliferate counters often will get me card draw or increase my time to lethal, it's a really close call, and I think both are completely valid. I definitely wouldn't run both, though. You reach the point where you just have too many like 3-mana protection spells. So anyway. And we already actually talked about a Ladberry's Call, right? Do I want more tutors? If I wanted more tutor in the list, this would be what I would play. All right, and that's it. That's my deck tech for Tidus. It's a lot of fun. It's a pretty inoffensive deck to play against, but it has a lot going on. It gets you better keeping track of counters, which is definitely something I needed to improve on, which is why I'm playing it. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see everyone next time.